In this video, we're going to take a look at what is Docker, how to write a Dockerfile to provide instruction on how to set up our application. And then we're going to talk about how to build a Docker image, how to work with a container to run our application, and also how to pass files or folders from our local file system to the container file system, and how to basically pass files or folders from the container to the local file system. We're also going to take a look at how to persist data using Docker volume. Now, what is Docker? Now, Docker is basically a tool to help us package our software so that it can run on any hardware. Now, to Dockerize our application, the process goes like this. First, the developer writes the application and also writes the Docker file. And the Docker file basically provides the instruction on how to build the Docker image and also the instruction on the environment setup. And then it builds the image, and the image is basically a file to execute the Docker container, which is immutable. It cannot be changed. And then if we want to run our application, we basically start our container. And the container is basically a running process of our application. In a real world scenario, basically a developer writes the application and then writes the Docker file to define the environment setups. And then it basically builds the Docker image. And then once the Docker image is built, it can be able to push to the cloud. And then the cloud can be able to use this image, the same image, to run one or multiple Docker containers. Now, before we start, I do recommend you to check out my other video where I did a tutorial on the basics of Linux command. Now, I do recommend you to have some Linux command experience before watching this video. Now, here you can see we have our React project. So to create a Docker file, I'll just go to the root directory of this project. I will basically create a new file called Dockerfile. So inside of a Docker file, we have to specify where the base image that we're inherited from. So in this case, the base image could be an operating system, for example, Linux or Windows, or it can be a runtime environment. In this case, it could be Python, right? If we're a Python developer, then we're basically using Python base image. And in this case, we're using JavaScript. So we're basically going to inherit from the Node base image. So here you can see we're basically on the Node official image in Docker Hub. And if we were to look at the description, you can see Node.js is a JavaScript-based platform for server-side and networking application. And if we were to go to tags, right? So there are a lot of Node images, right? Different versions of Node and different versions of Linux. So back to our Docker file. Let's say if we're basically specifying our base image as Node, then automatically Docker will basically build our image with the latest version of Node. So let's say if there's a new version, for example, Node version 18 or version 19 or 20 or whatever, then the current application we're using is Node version, for example, 16 or 15. Then this will basically give us or encounter some environment issues. So what we want to do instead is basically specifying the base image version. So to find the correct version, basically I need to know which version of Node we're using. So let's say I want to use Node version 16. And in this case, you can see here we have a lot of different versions still, right? So you can see we have, let's say we want to use Node version 16.13. In this case, you can see we can keep scrolling down. You can see many of them have larger compressed size. So let's say if I want to find a version where the compressed size is a bit smaller, I can search for Alpine. It will basically have a smaller compressed size, which basically leads to faster building the image. So in this case, let's say we want this one right here. For example, this is the one that we want. So I'll basically copy the tag and then I go back to the code and I basically specify the version. In this case, it's 16.13 Alpine. So now what we can do is we can build the image. So what I can do is I can specify the command. In this case, it's going to be docker build. And we're going to basically have our tag name, right? So it's going to be -t, and we're going to specify the image name. In this case, we are going to specify as React My App. And we also have to specify the path. In this case, we're going to put dot as going to be our current directory. So if I enter this will basically build the image. So now you can see I successfully built this image. And if I do docker image ls, I can basically be able to see all the images that I have in our current system. So you can see we have our React My App. So if I want to run it, I can basically do docker run and I specify the image. In this case, it's going to be React My App. But I also want to interact with it. So I'll basically do -it. And if I were to run this, this will basically run this image, and you can see we're running on version of Node is going to be version 16.13.2. And here you can see we're inside of the Node environment in Linux, and I can basically say, for example, console.log, right? Hello. And this will print hello. If I do 1 + 1, you can see we have 2, okay? Now we can also be able to have our shell session inside of our Alpine Linux. So if I were to stop this, for example, to exit, press Ctrl+C, and this will exit. So if I want to run, in this case, I'm running this image, but I want to be able to have a shell session. So I basically, at the end of it, I specify sh, and this will basically run a shell session. And what I can do is that if I do ls, you can see these are all the directories that we have, and I can also specify the version of Node. And you can see this is the version of Node that we're currently using. So right now you can see we basically have a Node runtime environment inside of our container. But what if I want to copy all the files, right, inside of our project to that container and be able to run it? How can we be able to do it? Well, first we need to be able to copy all the files inside of our project to that image file system. And what I need to do is I basically use the copy command, and you can see that we basically have to specify the source, right? Where are we copy the files and folders from, and the destination, which is the path to the images file system. And you can see here we can basically, destination can be a single file, right? For example, just a text file, or it could be multiple files, or it could be everything. For example, if I want to copy everything that we have inside of our current working directories, then I can basically say dot, and this will basically copy every files and folders. And I can also specify the destination. In this case, the destination is going to be a directory. So copy the new files and directory to this images file system. So this directory, I'm going to say app, right? So this is going to be our app. So in this case, we're going to copy all the files, right, inside of our project to this directory in the images file system. And if this directory doesn't exist in the file system, this will basically create that directory. Since we basically made a change in our Docker image, then we have to basically build our image again. And we basically run docker build -t react app, and path is going to be our root directory. So now you can see our image has been built. So now we can basically run our container. So I will basically run this. And if I were to do ls, you can see we have our app directory. So if I were to cd into app and I do ls again, you can see these are all the files and folders that we have copied to this images file system. So right now you can see we basically also have our no modules. So let's say if I want to exclude that, right? So how can I do that? Well, it's very similar to the get-ignore. So get-ignore, you can be able to ignore some folders, right, when you commit things, right, or some files or folders that you want before you commit things. I can do that same thing as well. So what I can do is I can create a file called dockerignore. So instead of dockerignore, I can basically specify what files or folders that I need to be ignored when I build the image. So in this case, I'll specify no modules. And if I were to run the build the image again, so let's say if I were exit, clear. So if I want to build this image again, this will basically exclude the no modules. So now after the image has been built, let's run our shell session. And if I do ls, cd into app, I do ls again, you can see no modules are gone. So right now you can see when I start a shell session, I have to cd into the app directory, but I can also be able to set app directory as a working directory so that when I start a shell session, I can basically go into or start in the app directory without cd into it. So let me show you. I can basically, inside of Docker image, I can set a working directory and I'll set it to /app, and then the destination, I will basically copy it to the working directory. In this case, it's going to be a dot, right? So if I were to go back to here and I build the image again, so I'll build the image and then I'll basically start our shell session, and you can see we're starting at the app directory. So now if I want to run, for example, npm install inside of our app directory, I can basically say run, right? This is going to be execute any commands on top of the current image as a new layer and commit the results, right? So you can see here, what I can do is I can basically do on npm install. But if I hover here, so you can see if I say run, you can see we can also do apt or package, right? Get In this case, let's say if I want to say package install Python, but this is not going to be possible because we're using Alpine. It has something called APK instead of APT. So that's something that we need to pay attention to. Now for the run command, we're going to say npm install. And we can also have multiple commands. For example, I also want to, for example, do an npm build or npm start or anything like that, right? But let's just do npm install for now. So if I were to build our image again, let's do exit. Let's build our image again. And then once the image is built, we're going to basically start, and you can see we're running npm I, which basically install the package. So now after we build the image, let's try to run our container and let's see if we have our npm or no modules. So if I do ls, you can see we have our no modules here. So now let's take a look at how we can be able to set environment variable inside of our Docker, right? Inside of our container. So here, if I want to specify the environment variable, I can, inside of our Dockerfile, I can basically say env command, use the env command to specify the key value, right? The environment variable. So here you can see I can specify the key. For example, let's say if my environment variable key is going to be API key, for example, right? And the value, let's say I can specify, for example, example.com. And notice that I don't need a quotation. So here you can see example.com is going to be the environment key, right? Or just example, for example, like, right? So if I were to save and rerun our container, or in this case, I should say rebuild our image. So once the image successfully built, then I can basically run the shell session. And if I want to, in this case, see all the environment variable, I can just say print env, and this will basically print all the environment variables. And you can see we have the host name, API key is equal to example, which is exactly what we set inside of the Docker file. So right now, if I were to run the application, you can see that we don't have any outputs. And the reason why we don't have any outputs, as you can see, is we basically install the packages, but we did not run the package at all, right? We didn't even run the application, the project at all. So what we need to do is we need to basically specify that we need to start the application, but we also need to make sure that the application is getting the information from a specific port. So what I can do is I can use a command called expose. Well, basically you can see that define the network ports that this container will listen on at the runtime. So the port is going to be 3000, right? And we're going to listen on that port in the container. And what we also need to do is we need to specify a command to run the application. So I will say cmd, and the cmd, you can see set the default executable and parameters for this executing container. So cmd is different compared to run. So run, you can see we can be able to provide an instruction, but that instruction is only for build time. And cmd, we can basically give instructions when we are in the runtime environment. So for cmd, I can basically say npm start, okay? And this is the instruction that we give during the runtime. So now let's try to build our image and let's try to run our application again. So once the image has been built, now we can basically run our application, right? Run our container. So if I were to run this, let's take a look at the output. So you can see the application started and is basically listening on port 3000. Just in a second. So once the image has been built, now we can basically run our application, right? Run our container. So if I were to run this, let's take a look at the output. So you can see the application started and is basically listening on port 3000. Just in a second. You can see here that this application is currently running and is running on localhost 3000. But the thing is that it's running on localhost 3000 for the container, but not the current machine. So you can see if I were to get, or in this case, go on to localhost 3000, I won't be able to see the site. So to resolve this problem, what we need to do is we need to basically publish a port to listen to a port in the container. So for our command docker run, we also have the option for port. So -p will stand for port, right? So we're basically publish a port. For example, the port number can be any number, right? It could be 100, right? It could be 10, it could be anything, right? And let's say for 10, and we're listening for a port that is in the container. In this case, it's going to be 3000 because we set it in the Dockerfile. So we're listening to port 3000 in the container, and we set or published our port to be 10. So if we were to run this, and we're basically going to start our container. So what's going to happen is we can be able to go to localhost port 10, and we can be able to see the app. So if I were to go 10, or just localhost, it should also be fine. Okay, maybe not. So you can see here, we have our localhost, and I set the port to 10, and you can see that we have our application running, right? So I'm published a port called called port 10, and that we're listening for port 3000 in the container. And you can see this is what we get, right? We get our application running. Now, there's also a couple commands or options that we can do other than just setting ports. For example, I can run this Docker container in a detached mode. So for example, instead of P to setting the port, right, to publish the port, I can set it to D, which basically means that I want to run the Docker container in a detached mode. So if I were to enter, this will basically run the container. Now you can see that we don't really see the message, right, for the log message when the application is running or when the container is running. But if I want to see the log message, I can also be able to retrieve that. So for example, if I want to see all the images that I have, all the containers that are currently running, I do docker-ps, short for processes. And this will give us all the containers that are currently running. You can see we have one container that are currently running. And if I want to see the log message, so I can do docker logs. And I will basically just type the first 3 letters of the Docker container ID. So 62D or 62B. And this will basically give us the output, right, or the log message. As you can see, the container port is running on this, right, and these are the log messages here. Now, what I want to talk about is how can we be able to go into the file system to maybe change some files while the current container is running, right? So right now you can see the current container is running. Of course, I don't want to kill it, but I want to go into that container and be able to access or change a file, for example, right? How can I do that? So to do that, basically I have to gain access to the file system. So I will use docker-exec or short for execute, right? And basically we can be able to specify the container name. In this case, the name is this one right here. Copy that, paste it here, right? So execute for this container. And then we're going to basically can run any command. For example, let's say if I want to do ls, right? This will basically list out all the files that's currently in the working directory. Now we can also have a shell session, right? We can create a shell session. For example, I can basically say docker, right, execute, and I'm going to set it to interactive mode. And for this Docker name, I'm going to start a shell session. And now we're basically inside of our container or inside of our container file system. So I can basically do anything. For example, I can do any Linux command, right? For example, manipulating a file or reading a file, deleting something, or create a new directory, right? For example, if I do ls, right? These are the files and directories that are under the working directory, right? And I can also be able to cat package.json, right? So these are the things that's inside of the package.json. So you can see we can do any Linux command inside of our shell session. Now, if I want to stop a container that is currently running, so you can see here, if I do docker-ps, this is the current container that's running. So if I want to stop it, I will just do docker stop, and I have to specify the container. In this case, it's going to be 62b, and this will basically stop the container. Yes, okay, so let's do docker-ps. And let's see. So there's no container that's currently running. And if I want to start a container, right, I want to start that container again, right? What I can do is I can do start docker instead of docker run, because docker run will basically start a container that doesn't exist. But since this container used to be running, but we just stop it. Now, if I want to restart it again, right, I can basically do start instead of run. And I specify the container ID, in this case, 262b. I start that, this will basically start the container. And if I do docker-ps again, okay, and I do docker logs, for example, type in the container name, this will give us the log message. and this is what the host is currently running on. So now what I want to talk about is how can we be able to persist data in our Docker. So right now, if I want to create a container or start a container, then if I were to shut it down, then the data that's created inside of that container will be lost. So in this case, what we need to talk about is how can we be able to persist data, and we're going to use something called volume. So to create a Docker volume, here's what I did. So I say Docker volume and I create. So this is the create command. And I also basically specify the volume name. In this case, is app data. So here you can see these are all the commands that we can use for Docker volume. So for example, we can create, inspect, right, display detailed information on one or more volumes, or list out all the volumes, or prone, remove all unused volumes or local volumes, right? So right now, if I want to see all the volumes that we have, right? So I'll just say docker volume ls, and this will basically list out all the volumes, right? So you can see we have one of them here. So if I want to remove them, I can either do remove or I can do prone. So do prone, basically remove all of them. So are you sure you want to remove that? Yes, right. So now what's going to happen is we're going to create a new volume and we're going to start a container that persists data using this volume. And what's going to happen now is that we're going to say docker volume, right? Create, and we're going to give it a name. In this case, we're going to call it data store. And once we create our volume, we're going to say docker start, or in this case, docker run. So we're going to run the container. So you can see here, we're going to run, and this is going to be our port that listens to this container port, and we're going to have our volume. And in this case, you can see the volume is going to be data store, and the absolute path that we're going to persist data inside of our container is going to be this absolute path right here, right? And then the image is going to be React My App, and we're going to run this in detached mode. So we're going to say -d. Okay, and let's run it. Okay, once this is run or start the container, right, we're going to create a shell session, and let's try to basically create some data inside of this directory and see if we can be able to persist this data. So now, once the container is started, we can be able to run our container in a interactive mode. So docker execute interactive mode, and this is going to be the name of our container, right, from here, and then this is the shell session. So let's run this. So once we're in the shell session, let's do ls, and you can see we have our data directory. So let's go to data, and let's see. So there's nothing inside of our data directory. So let's try to create a file. So let's do echo, right? And we're going to create some text file inside of the data directory. So let's say hello, or hello world, for example. And we're going to basically have a file.txt. Okay, and let's do ls again. You can see we have a file, and let's do cat file.txt. You can see we have our content inside of this text file. So now let's clear it, and what we're going to do is we're going to exit, and we're also going to stop our container. So let's do docker ps one more time to see all the containers. So this is the container that's currently running. Okay, so if I want to stop it, I'll just do docker stop, right? And we're going to specify the container ID. So it's going to be 6c6. So we're going to stop this container. We're going to do docker ps again. And then we're going to start a container one more time. So once we start a container, we're going to cd and also start a shell session, right? And then we're going to cd into it. So let's do docker ps one more time to get a name. Okay, docker. We're going to change this name to the current Docker container name. And once we're in the shell session, let's cd into data. And let's do ls. And you can see we have our file.txt. And let's do cat file.txt. This is the content that we have. So you can see the data is persisted. So now what I want to talk about is how can people to transfer files back and forth. So here's our host and here's our container. So what I want to show first is how can people to transfer a file inside of a container to the host. So right now I'm in the container in the shell session. So if I do ls, right, you can see we have a file. So let's cd out of that and let's create a new file, right? Let's call it a log file. So let's do echo right, we're going to have, for example, this is log message, for example, right? And let's put that in a file called log.txt. And let's do ls again. You can see we have our log.txt. So now if I want to take this file and put it in our project my app directory, right? So in this case, first let's exit out of it, and we're going to use a command called docker copy. Now this copy, we basically have to specify the source. Where is the, so let's take a look at the container first. Okay, so this is the container, right? So first, the source is going to be the container ID. So we're going to copy the container ID. And then we also have to specify which file are we going to copy from, right? So we're going to specify the absolute path. So it's going to be app/log.txt. And this is going to be the file that we want to copy. And we're going to specify the destination. In this case, we're going to copy it to the root directory of our current application, or in this case, my app, right? So if I do this, and if I were to do ls again, you can see we have a file called log.txt. And let's do log.txt. You can see this is a log message, right? We can be able to see the message or the content of that log file. We can also validate that if we were to go to our Visual Studio or File Explorer, and you can see we have our log.txt. So that's basically the first part, right? We take file from the container and we basically copy it and then paste it to the host, right? We transfer the file to here. And now what I want to do is I want to show you how we can be able to transfer a file from the host, right? Or copy the file from host to the container. So let's say if I want to create a new file, for example, message.txt. And this is message, for example, and I want to be able to copy this file, right, from the host to the container. So what I do is the same thing. So I'll use the Docker, let's do clear Docker copy, right? We're basically copying the file called message.txt, right? And we paste it, or in this case, we're transfer that to the Docker container as well. Docker container ID, right? So Docker copy, in this case, is going to be the message.txt, and then we're basically paste it to here, right? So we're going to specify the absolute path of where we're going to paste it, or where we're going to transfer it. So we're going to say, just say app, right? And let's see. So now what's going to happen is that if we were to run the session again, okay, let's do ls, you can see we have our message.txt. And if I were to do cat message.txt, you can see this is the content, right? So this is message. Now, this is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching this far. Now, if you like this content, please consider like and subscribe. And if you do have any ideas or any comments, please leave them in the comment section. Thank you very much.